Hi everyone, and welcome to this Valkyrie sound tutorial. In this video we're going to look at sound mixing, controlling sound groups to enrich the player experience. I'm using Qubit Studio's Ballistics VFX pack for this video from the Epic Marketplace. There's a link to the store page in the description below. This isn't a sponsored video, I already owned this pack, but it is a good, ready-made set of visuals and audio that I can use to demonstrate how to mix sounds effectively. Unreal Engine uses sound class mixes to adjust the levels of in-game audio and apply some effects. To use them, you'll need to create sound classes once you've added your sound cues to your project. Sound class mixes can then control parameters and settings for each sound class. You can create a sound class for one specific sound, such as a huge explosion in a cutscene. For groups of sounds, such as your in-game music or weapon impacts. And for subgroups of sounds that you want to keep separate from a larger group. In this demo I've kept ricochet sounds separate to other impact sounds, so I have greater control over how those sounds are mixed. Sound classes are useful for allowing both you and the player to adjust audio levels, setting the volume of music, sound effects and voices, etc. They're useful for applying specific effects, such as cutting high frequencies for a short period of time following an explosion, or lowering the volume of every sound except voices when a character is talking, known as audio ducking. And in short, sound classes are a straightforward way of managing in-game sound, both in terms of applying presets and allowing user configuration, but also in enabling you, as the sound designer, to adjust audio parameters based on the player's actions and in-game events. There are 6 nodes related to sound mixes in Blueprint. If we go to the level blueprint of this ballistics map, you can see that we have the first node here, set base sound mix. And it does exactly what it says. It applies a sound mix to the game that acts as a base layer. I'm calling this in the level blueprint and it's being loaded as soon as the game starts. You can see that it's loading sound mix normal. So let's go and check that out. So this is what the mostly collapsed sound mix looks like. We have an EQ or equalizer section here. There are 4 bands, so we can contour the sound frequencies for all sounds in this class at 4 distinct points. The most obvious application for this is music, but you may want to apply equalization for specific locations or scenes. Later we'll look at a Submix EQ, where we can add as many EQ bands as we like for greater control. Next, we have the sound classes section. This is where we add all the sound classes affected by this sound mix. Because this is my default mix, all the classes that I've created for this map are present. For each sound class loaded in, we have the same options. We can adjust the volume of each sound class, the pitch, and apply a low pass filter at a specific frequency. Now these values, the volume and pitch, are all multipliers. For example, the default volume in a sound cue is 0.75. If we change the class's volume adjuster to 0.5, the actual volume of this set of sounds will be 0.375. We can apply these effects to children, if this sound class is a parent, and we can adjust the center channel volume. Unfortunately, my surround sound system isn't working right now, so I can't test this out, but I believe this lets us increase the volume of sounds routed to the center speaker in a 5.1 or 7.1 setup. That feature is typically used for dialogue, ensuring it cuts cleanly through the mix. You'll often find that in movies. And finally, at the very bottom, we have the sound mix section. This is where we can specify an initial delay to the start of the sound mix, which could be useful if we're triggering it from an asset that we're immediately destroying, like an actor. We have the fade in and fade out times, and that is obviously how long it's going to take us to transition to the sound mix from an existing one, and how long it'll take us to transition to the next one. And we have duration. Again, this is useful if we're calling the mix from a short-lived actor that we destroy, useful for cutscenes, and it's useful for scene changes in video. So if you open the sound class section back up, you can see that I've organized each of the sound cues into distinct groups. We have impacts, music, ricochets, voiceover or VO, weapons, other, and explosions for the player and the environment, as well as a master class. And you can see that the volume levels are different for each of these classes, and that's all I'm using this mix for, to apply a volume to each of these sound groups. Let's open up the master sound class. So here we can see that the master sound class is attached to all of the other sound classes, which are its children. You can see we have a list of options down here on the left hand side. I'm not going to go through every item on here, but I'm going to highlight one or two. So here in the top left we have the same options that we found in the sound mix. These are separate from that and they're not linked to the sound mix in any way. Again, volume and pitch are multipliers. Next we have the list of child classes. And below that we have a section where we can add a passive sound mix modifier. By default this is empty. I've just added one in here. I've applied this to the voiceover sound class. When the audio engine detects any volume in that class, the voiceover class, it'll load in the voiceover sound mix here. So let's have a look at that. To get a list of the active sound mixes and active sound cues when you're in the game, press tilde, which is just above tab and to the left of 1 on a standard keyboard. Outside of the game it brings up the command console at the bottom of the screen. In game it'll bring up at the bottom of the main window, and you want to type in stat sound mixes, and that will give you, it deactivates it if you re-enter it, but that will give you a list of the active sound mixes as you move around the map. And stat sound cues will give you the list of active sound cues as you're in the game. So now if we press play, there we are, we have the harp music playing. If I fire the gun, we have the sound of the rifle fire, and we have some impacts as well. And when I stand on here,
oh hello there.
You can see that we've faded in
about any visitors today,
the voiceover.
But I suppose you appear to be reputable.
Okay, so the weapon volume is lowered to 0.4 of its base level value. So let's fire the gun while the character is talking.
Oh hello there. The master didn't inform me about any visitors today, but I suppose you appear to be reputable.
It was more obvious towards the end after the character had finished talking, but you can tell there was an increase in volume at the end there, which of course tells us that the weapon sound was reduced in volume while the narrator was talking. So you'll notice in here that you can add more than one passive sound mix modifier. You can add as many as you like, but it might be worthwhile documenting what's affecting your mix so you can keep track of things and you know where to go if you need to edit or troubleshoot any of your mixes. One of the great strengths of Unreal is that there's more than one way of doing something. So let's jump back to our level blueprint. And we have two more nodes. We have the push sound mix modifier and the pop sound mix modifier. The first one loads up a new sound mix and the second one unloads it. That means we'll revert back to whatever base sound mix has been applied. If there's no base sound mix, when you pop the modifier, the sounds will just go back to whatever volumes they're assigned in their respective sound cues. So let's try that out. If we start with the base sound mix, and then we push a new sound mix, that'll be instant. That's just going to be the impacts, so we'll only hear the impacts of our weapons fire. There'll be a delay of 4 seconds, we'll get a string message saying we're unloading the mix, and then we will pop that sound mix, which will revert back to the normal mix we'd set here in our base. Let's keep an eye in the upper left corner so we can see the message that tells us when the mix is being changed. So this highlights the importance of using the set base sound mix node to establish a base mix for your sounds, and when we use a mix modifier and pop that, the audio can only fall back to the default levels that you want. So let's try it the other way. If we just go straight into pushing the sound mix modifier, after 4 seconds we're going to pop that, and all of our sounds are going to go back to their default sound cue levels. So there you can see that the active sound cue that's still sitting there, the harp, was at maximum volume, but the sounds overall were a lot louder, and that's across the whole mix. Aside from affecting gameplay, mixes can also let you isolate a specific group of sounds for tweaking and debugging. As we've just seen, I've added a mix that mutes every sound except the impacts. That isolates those sounds and allowed me to set the appropriate concurrency for that group. Concurrency allows us to limit the number of sounds that spawn within the world. We can limit the sounds globally or by owner, which is useful for games with many characters where the limit on global sounds might be quickly exceeded. We have different policies that we can apply to the culling or removal of each sound. So let's load up the impacts concurrency. Here we have the max count. Here we can make it a global or actor specific limit. And here we have the resolution rule, which is basically a policy that we can apply to the culling or removal of each sound to ensure we don't exceed our max count. Stop farthest then oldest is the default, but amongst our other settings we can prevent new sounds from being called altogether, or stop sounds with the lowest priority, a priority which we can assign in the sound queue. Concurrencies are assigned at the sound queue level. The default max count is 16. I've dropped this to 12 for the impact sounds, because there's no discernible difference between 12 and 16 sounds being called. If there's no real difference, then you might wonder why bother making the change. Well, with only one character, there's a pretty limited performance impact. But if this was a deathmatch against a dozen AI-controlled bots who, for the sake of argument, are all firing their guns, and each bot is close enough to the player for them to hear all of the impacts, and the player is firing back, then if we leave the max count at 16, we have a maximum potential of 208 impact sounds being called, and, depending on their duration, 208 impact sounds being in play at any one moment. If we limit the max count to 12 sounds, our upper limit is 156. That's 52 fewer sounds for our system to load and process. And that's just the impacts. We also have each of the 12 bots and the player character firing their individual weapons, movement sounds, voices, environmental ambience, interface sounds, and music. We could have hundreds of sounds active at any one time. So we can use concurrency to reduce that number and lessen the load on the player's end system. But it's not just about system performance, or just about how the player's speakers will cope with the audio being sent. It's also about managing the player experience. We want to prioritize the important sounds, sounds that we as game and sound designers flag as important and pertinent to the type of game we're making. And we want to help the player make sense of the game environment and enable them to respond appropriately. There's also no real need to transmit audio that the player won't notice or can't detect when many other sounds are in play. For this demo, I've included 3 concurrencies: a limit of 12 sounds for impacts, a limit of 8 sounds for ricochets, and a limit of 4 for explosions. The explosions will be called oldest first, the others oldest and farthest first. So let's test that out. We'll look specifically at the explosion sounds, and we'll switch off the concurrency. So we'll clear that out, save, and let's load this in. So that generated 20 odd sound cues just from the explosions. But how many sounds could you actually hear? Really? Probably only 2 or 3. So if we limit this to 4, if we now apply our concurrency, let's try that again. Only 5 sounds that time, and the overall player experience isn't going to be affected by that in a negative way. So it's important to consider concurrency when you are putting your sounds into the game as well. Now there's something you might have noticed when those explosions were in play. We're going to have a look at that scene again, and this time I'm going to fire the rifle and launch the grenades, and you'll see what I'm referring to. So, what's happening here? Well, in the grenade blueprint, this is the grenade launched blueprint, just before the sound is loaded in, we have an extra node that I've added here, the push sound mix modifier. And the mix that we're loading is ducking explosion. Ducking basically nudges down sound A, so sound B can become more prominent in the mix. It's a method of managing the overall volume of sounds while avoiding the clipping that you might get if you just increase the volume of sound B. An explosion is the quintessential example of ducking. It's in every action movie and in many action games. We can apply similar effects to underwater scenes and other spaces, but the explosion sound differs from those in that it is a temporary effect and is event specific rather than being location specific. To set this up, I copied the normal sound mix and reduced the volumes of all classes except the two explosions classes, which are made a little louder. So if we have a look at the impacts section here at the top, impacts has 1, music 0.1, ricochets 0.8. If we compare those to the first three values of the explosion ducking sound mix, 0.8 for impacts, 0.5 for music, which is a 0.5 effect on the normal mix, remember, and then 0.6 on ricochets and so on. So here you'll see that I've set the volume adjuster of the SC Explosions player to 1.4. I wouldn't normally set any sound above 1, but if the sound's volume is say at 0.5, then increasing it by 1.4 will make its actual volume 0.7. It's good to keep a tab on this so you don't accidentally push volumes so high that they start to clip. You can also see that I've changed the amount of the low pass filter frequency for all the other sounds to 150, with the exception of weapons. This means we're cutting all frequencies above those values to 0 volume. That gives us a flattening effect that movies and games have told us is what people experience when a very loud sound goes off. So now we get a nice representative sound of an explosion that conforms to the player's expectations. And at the very bottom of the mix, we have a fade-in time, the default, 0.2, a duration set to 1.5 because we're calling this from the grenade blueprint, which is an actor, and which is going to be destroyed once it hits something, and a fade-out time of 1. We need to use duration because the actor isn't alive long enough for us to pop or unload the explosion sound mix after the sound has finished playing. The explosion sound cue is made up of 2 parts, and I know that the longest length of the cue is around 3.6 seconds. So I've set the mix duration and fade out to cover the majority of that time. As this mix is being pushed every time a grenade is being fired, the mix will keep getting triggered until the final instance of the spawned actor is destroyed. In this case, it's better, in my opinion, to push the mix from the actor rather than using the passive sound mix modifier setting in the sound class that we looked at earlier. To get the same result, we'd need to monitor the volume of the sound to find the correct volume to trigger the mix, and that just feels more unwieldy to me. So let's have a look at the before and after effects. Let's skip this node. So this is it before. All very good. And this is it with that mix applied. But wait, there's more. If we go back into the explosion sound cue, you'll see that further down we have a submix. A submix allows us to apply preset effects to a sound cue and or a sound class. We can then adjust the properties of these presets to get specific results. The presets are convolution reverb, delay, dynamics processor, filter, flexiverb, reverb fast, reverb, submix EQ, tap delay. I'm not going to go into each of those in this video, but we can have a little look at 2 submixes I've applied to the explosions sound cue. To create this, by the way, you would right-click, Sounds, and go to Effects. That would create the submix effect preset, which is this, the pink one. And to get the green one here, where we load the presets into, right-click, Sounds, and Mix. Concurrency, by the way, is here. Your sound cue, as you know, is here. Classes, under the classes section, that's a class and the class mix. So if we open up our submix explosions, you'll see here nothing. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that I've added in 2 submix presets. First, we have a filter, and you have several options here. a low pass, high pass, band pass or band stop, and I've applied a low pass filter, so any sounds above 14,000 Hz are going to be culled. I've also applied an equalizer or EQ, and I've added two bands here, one at 500 Hz and the other at 10,000 Hz. You can add as many bands as you like, refining your control across the whole frequency range. Back in our level blueprint, we have 3 more nodes related to sound mixing. Set sound mix class override. Clear sound mix class override. The first node lets you apply volume and pitch changes, again these are multipliers, for a specific sound class in a specific sound mix. The mix doesn't have to be active at the time you make this change, so you could queue up changes in advance if you needed to. And if the sound class doesn't exist in the mix that you're trying to change, then this node will add it. For this demonstration, I've increased the volume of the music sound class and lowered the pitch, and these effects will fade in over 2 seconds. After a short delay, I then clear that override with a fade of 4 seconds. In my testing, pitch doesn't follow this fade, so you may get some unwanted effects using these nodes if your changes affect pitch. So let's have a listen to the effect that has. And finally, the Clear Sound Mix Modifiers node will remove any sound mix modifiers currently in play. If you've already loaded a bass mix, you'll revert back to that, but of course if you haven't, you won't. From my testing, the fade time here is determined by the fade out of whatever mix was currently active. And that's it. Take care, enjoy making your own projects, and, as always, thanks for watching.